All right, well, thank you guys all for joining today and hearing our table talk session. I am Michelle Contreras from BlackRock, and I am the head of academies and have the pleasure of spending some time with a few of my colleagues to really give you guys some perspective on how LGBT leaders are navigating through our cultural and professional nuances working abroad, including navigating that same thing as an LGBT family. So before I really kick into what we're going to share today, I want to give everyone an opportunity to do some quick introductions. So Matt, can I start with you?
Sure thing. Good afternoon, everybody. My name is Matt Chikotovich. My pronouns are he, him, his. I'm currently based in Mexico City. Got to move in the middle of a pandemic, which was wonderful timing. And I work with Mexican financial advisors down here in the Mexico City area, distributing our mutual funds.
Perfect. And if you guys could, before we continue on, please mute your lines. Thank you. All right, Joe, how about a quick introduction from you as well?
Get that unmute button to work. Hi, everybody. My name is Joe Crowley. I am the global head of learning and the head of HR for our Atlanta Innovation Hub. So calling in from Atlanta, Georgia. I've been with our firm for about 14 years and have lived in several countries. I'm really excited to share that with you all today.
Awesome. And Mark.
Great. Thank you all for joining us tonight. I'm Mark Schisler. I'm a director on our iShares and index investing business. I'm calling in from the New York City office tonight, and I actually had the pleasure of moving back to the United States right in time for the start of the pandemic after spending 2.5 years in London as chief of staff to the head of EMEA. And we look forward to spending the next hour with you all.
Great. All right, so we are going to jump right in. And like I mentioned, this is kind of our table talk session. So please, if you have questions, feel free to drop them in the chat. We'll try to get to them as we can. But I guess let me just dive right in, right? So what's interesting about this session as we were thinking about it, in my mind, working abroad, being in the States, being an LGBT member of the LGBT community is all a little bit interesting navigating. So let's just be real about it. It's not easy to navigate and come out as an LGBT member in the States, let alone doing that in a country that's still emerging. Collectively, this group has already lived in about 15 plus countries, and certainly a lot of different experiences navigating the different cultural and professional nuances working abroad. So as I dive in, our first question for this group is going to be, what was the first thing you considered about going abroad? And what was your first thought as an LGBT member? How about Joe? Would you like to pick us off?
Sure. I grew up in the southern part of the U.S., but actually moved quite a bit. And I think I moved 9 times before I was 12. So the idea of moving was something that was like a very natural rhythm for me. And as I finished university and like entered the professional world, one of the things that I hadn't had an opportunity to do was really travel abroad. It was one of the first things I did. Once I did that, I think I got the kind of wanderlust to move globally, want to move globally. And so I made it, every role I had kind of early in my career, I made it very clear with my management that it was something that I wanted to pursue. I kind of came out to myself and the world in the kind of like, I guess it was early 90s. And so like navigating back then a life where, you know, my corporate identity and my like personal identity weren't necessarily one and the same, but it didn't necessarily like shut down my desire to be a global citizen. So I'd say like in the very earliest part of my career, my first opportunity to live abroad was when I moved to France. You know, I was early in my career, a younger person and single, so it wasn't something that I was particularly concerned about. And I also worked in kind of what I would consider a safe profession in the sense of working in technology and working in consulting. So it was very easy to kind of like keep my identity separate, but it was also something I think at that period of time that I found very unsatisfactory. And later on in my career, after I joined BlackRock and had the opportunity to move abroad, like it was something that was super important. Like I really thought about what was that experience? Was I going to an organization that was going to be inclusive and welcoming, given the state of the world at that time. But it was something that was like always part of who I was, but it wasn't going to stop my desire of, I wasn't going to like let my dreams not become pursued just because it might be more complicated.
Yeah, no, thanks for sharing that. Mark, Matt, how about you guys?
Yeah, maybe I'll step in here. And Joe, the first time that I went abroad, I was in a very similar situation. I think I told some of your colleagues that it might be the easiest relocation ever because I don't have a partner, I don't have children, and you're just picking me up out of a rent that I can break and moving over to London. But before getting into some of my first thoughts, just to level set, people have relocated to places that are a lot more difficult to do so than in London. I knew right off the bat that there would be challenges associated with it, but at the same time that I knew that being out wouldn't be necessarily dangerous or challenging for me professionally, even though it would be a change. My immediate thought when I was being considered for the role was that I would be away from my personal support systems that I had back in New York City. Because at the time, I had always been quite adventurous when it came to travel or meeting new people. I've been through reorganizations and job changes before. And so the idea of taking on a new role in a new country wasn't the most daunting thing. But I think what I had the most anxiety about was breaking the news to my family and to the people that I was spending a lot of time with in New York City. But I really wanted to go for this. So I was kind of saying, like, would they be excited? Would they be nervous? Would they be sad? And for those that I thought would be a little bit sad or reluctant for me to, hop over and try this, were among the first people to start calling dibs on weekends to visit. So it ultimately was pretty seamless. And I'm really happy that I dove at it when I had the chance to do it.
Nice. And Mark, let me ask you a follow-up on that one. It's a little interesting. You talk about leaving your support system. What was it like building a new support system in London?
It's interesting because a lot of things were going on at exactly the same time, where it's a new skill set, a new country. The UK isn't the easiest place to get a bank account or an apartment if you aren't from there, and you kind of need one to get the other. So it's this little catch-22. But at the same time, I think the first year, it was really based around the office. We were lucky to have a good culture there where I knew a few people through the Out and Allies network, and there were a couple expats here and there that I had been connected with outside of work to start building that. But again, those are people that have been in your life for 2 months, not the people who were with you when you came out 8 years ago. So the way that I ultimately built the support system that I have now today, and that brought me through COVID, since I had moved maybe a week before the pandemic started, was through just doing group activities, things like group fitness classes and picking up sports teams that I had to pretend to be passionate about, and just getting to know people that way.
Good. Awesome. Matt, do you want to add anything to that?
Yeah, I mean, on my end, speaking Spanish was my biggest objective here, and living and working in a Spanish speaking country was one of my top career goals. So finally got tapped on the shoulder for an opportunity down in Mexico City. So it was a natural move, and I had visited a couple times and had made some great, gay friends down there from, my travels. But I didn't really think very hard about what it would be like with the new office culture in Mexico City, very buttoned up professional culture, and what it would be like with my clients. And I realized, LGBTQ was not exactly as much as a, national conversation as it was in the US. So definitely had to figure out how to, become my full self again, all over again down in Mexico City. But I will say, to Mark's point, building that support system from scratch has definitely been a challenge down here, since I did move officially in January, and everything was shut down. So I will say the office is one of those places where you form that initial group of people that have your back. You have that common, in this case, BlackRock thread that brings you together. So as we go back into the office, it's really helping build that support system.
Nice. So Joe, I'm going to actually come back to you for a moment because you talked about one of your first experiences going abroad, maybe being when you were single. Tell us about what it was like when you were taking an abroad assignment with a family intact. What were your deal breakers? What were your priorities? And you guys making that decision together?
Yeah, well, that was a completely different experience. You know, I think just to set context, so in 2015, my husband and I had the opportunity, or I had the opportunity to lead human resources for our Japanese operations. I think the things that ran through my mind when the opportunity was first presented to me was, one, I didn't speak any Japanese. I'd never been to Japan. Two, legally, like what was the landscape for LGBTQ folks in Japan? Obviously knew culturally there was a real affinity for American things, but like I really didn't have a strong sense of that. As we kind of took the weekend, once the offer kind of proposal was made, my husband and I, and at the time, frankly, we had a 1.5 year, we had an 18-month-old adopted daughter. And so, you know, we were really kind of reflecting. Now, the things that we went into that with were, we had lived in Denmark, Switzerland, Italy, like before. So like we knew what it was like to be a couple, be a couple in a foreign environment, in ones that had various different, like kind of like I would say social and legal ramifications. And so we had navigated that before. And I was really happy to have had that experience with my husband, because we kind of like navigated that. So we're like, okay, how much harder can it be? But we knew how much often kind of time and effort it could take when thinking about a child. I think the thing we discovered very quickly was my daughter and I could go, was unclear about whether or not my husband would legally be able to go. And so I think some of the first steps were really understanding like what it was going to take. Like sometimes, and I think for folks on the phone, if they're, you know, came into this call today and say like, okay, hey, I might have an interest in doing that, how hard it is. It's an ultra marathon at times. So like you have to be patient. There isn't a country where there isn't a ton of paperwork. But what I will say on the very optimistic side is, if it's something you really want, there's usually a way to resolve it and find it. In our case, I was very fortunate to have colleagues at BlackRock in our Asia Pacific offices. Like our immigration partner initially said, nope, there's no way, it's not going to happen. And then I had our colleagues who led our rewards team and really understood that and had lived and worked in Japan. A straight colleague that I did not know, and I call that out because he spent countless hours, time, and effort to get the approvals. It actually went to one of the committees of our global board of directors to get approval to use a different partner who was our audit partner to actually do the work to get us into Japan. And so, and ultimately in my husband's case, it went to something called the Supreme, oh God, I forgot, it was the Supreme something of national immigration, because they just didn't know what to do with it. And apparently when we found out at the end is we were the 12th same-sex couple to get a full approval to have like a spouse travel into the country. So what it always comes back to Phil and I is, we want to be the change we want to see in the world. And so we were willing to do that. We also have like clearly an adventurous spirit in wanting to go into these places where like we can't speak the language, we don't know anybody, but we've got each other. I will say the funny anecdote is my daughter and I had the very expected and pretty visa stamp, you know, and label in our passport. And my husband had a piece of paper that in Japanese said that he was my property. And so that made for a lot of jokes and basically colleagues and so amongst our family. So, you know, you make a couple steps forward, but also realize what you're doing. For us, the experience was like amazing. I think the biggest challenge was, I think a lot of Japanese people thought we were like the best husbands in the world because we were clearly letting our wives have the day off. But we definitely got a lot of questions from local Japanese of like, where's the mother? And my husband usually raised a hand and he's like, I'm the mom. And then it took him a few seconds and then there was nervous laughter. but then they moved on because like culturally they're very, you know, it was like actually quite accepting. And we were more of, we were more intriguing. We were more of a curiosity because they just don't have some of the other hangups you might find in other parts of the world.
Awesome, thanks. And so Mark and Matt, hopefully that gives you guys some perspective what it might be like navigating that with a family at some point down the line. I'm curious.
I'm too single to worry about that right now.
All right,
We
we'll
have
get
bigger
into
fish
that in
to
a little
fry.
bit. We'll get into that for sure. I'm curious, and maybe this is, either Mark or Matt, feel free to chime in here. We talk about leaving a support system, coming back into, or having to build a new support system. What is it like even having to go into a new office in a new country where no one knows you personally yet, right? So they don't know your LGBT status, none of that. What is that like?
I think Mark could probably agree with this, but you have to start all over again. Like all that hard work, all the years of being out and louder and prouder, where you grew up professionally, starts over. And a lot of people have questions. In my case, a lot of people just assumed. And I remember I had just become my first time managing a team. I had, 4 employees, and we went out to lunch my first week there. And one of the girls on my team asked me if I had a novia back in the US, meaning girlfriend. And I was like, oh, haha, nervous laughter. Actually, I'm single, but this is all in Spanish. And I had to correct her. I was like, but I think it would be better to ask if I have a novio or boyfriend. And I think I broke her brain because she was just so confused about, and then the whole table got really quiet. And then later someone had to explain to her, like, he's gay. So it's, those little moments happen again, all with the purest of intentions. But I think it's a little bit harder to pick up on like some of the queer cues that you give, or the accent throws people off because they can't pick it up in the same way. So people just assume. So a lot of those moments over the past year and a half.
That is so interesting. And I can totally relate, not even from necessarily in a broad perspective, but when I speak Spanish, my wife is Dominican. And so I picked up a lot of Spanish, and people often say, oh, es tu esposo. And I'm like, no, mi esposa. They're like, huh? So it's always fun
little
see
game
that.
we get to play.
Exactly. Matt, how about you? Or Mark, I'm sorry.
Yeah, and so my situation was a little bit different because 2 months before I relocated to London, I had given the opening speech at our 10-year anniversary, which was the 10th anniversary of our Out and Allies network, which was pretty well attended in our London office. And the head of the region, who I was going there to work for, was the sponsor of our network. So, without getting into gory detail, there was general awareness when I got there that I was gay and that I was out and also really involved in the network. But for the people who didn't go to that event or hadn't been engaging with the networks, I think one of the big learnings that I took away is that you're coming out again. And for somebody at the time who had been out for 8, 9, 10 years, you start to take for granted that there are millions of people that are going through the same thing that you are. You're coming out again, but they're doing it for the first time. So, and I was client facing. So when I would meet with certain salespeople or with a client for the first time, look, I'm sure there are plenty of things that I did during those interactions that made it apparent. However, it's not always necessarily apparent or obvious. So in 2010, when I was coming out, I kind of got in a rhythm of telling the same story over and over again. And then you just forget it because you become so comfortable within your own bubble. And in New York, like, again, there was no coming back. I was out. But in the UK, all of a sudden, when somebody says, so I bet you've met a ton of girls in London, or like that kind of thing, you have to like retrain yourself to have that conversation. And to be frank, it's not that comfortable. Doing it at 20 versus 30 is not the same thing. And also doing it the second time versus the first time is not the same thing. So that is something that I really took to heart. And when I met an individual at any age, by having that lesson again in my professional experience, I learned that there's no time frame for it. It's not a race, and that everyone has their own individual story, and having an empathetic ear is the most important thing that you can do. The only other key takeaway that I wanted to get across is that there was a bit of a risk baked in, given the fact that I had just presented to the London office as the global chair of the LGBT network and showing up for a new role that was somewhat visible, is that there's the risk of getting pigeonholed into being the ERG person, or the one that is only focused on X. But at the same time, I was there to do a job that was a bit technically and strategically oriented. And nobody in that office knew anything about the projects that I had worked on in the US or what I had done. So their first impression was, this person is giving a speech about LGBT equality and inclusion. So one of the things that was really important to focus on right away was to prove myself again, while carrying the flag, that I'm also contributing to revenue and results in addition to creating a more inclusive environment. And those things are interdependent, they depend on each other. But I've definitely seen in the past situations where it's not always that straightforward to do so. So it's coming out again and also proving yourself again as a professional.
Yeah, and Mark, I'm going to play on that a little bit because you talk about kind of holding the flag and still trying to prove yourself. Let's talk a little bit about, did you feel a sense of needing to kind of wear your pride on your shoulder and really be an LGBT advocate?
So, the thing that I would say about that is the larger offices generally had larger offices, and what I mean by that are places for BlackRock. It's not like that at every company, where you have New York, San Francisco, and London. And Joe can speak a little bit better about the relationship between Hong Kong and Tokyo and other APAC countries. But between New York, San Francisco, and London, you have 2,000 plus people there. By definition, there are LGBT people there, and our networks had been running for 10 plus years. But my role was pan-European. So I had travel and client responsibility in places like Milan, Copenhagen, Zurich, and Dubai. And a lot of those offices have 30, 40, 50 people. And whereas a new employee in an office like London can network their way into meeting another LGBT person at a fundraiser or a social event, somebody who walks into Milan for the first time or into Madrid for the first time may realize that they're the only LGBT or non-binary person there. So instead of carrying the flag, I felt more of a responsibility to be available and to have that ear for somebody who wanted to have a private conversation about the nuances of coming out in the smaller offices, because there's not the same amount of opportunities to have events and networking. So that's kind of where I felt responsibility, was by being available to people who were in a 20-person office and realizing that they were the only person that was non-hetero, non-cisgender.
Thank you. Joe, Matt, let me open up that question to you guys. I think you guys may have an interesting different opinion.
Yeah, I can go. I mean, I can talk a little bit about my experience in APAC. So when I landed on the ground in like June of 2015, which is very, very hot and humid. If anyone's been to Tokyo, it's like living on the surface of the sun. One of the biggest first realizations that I had was, and with a couple other colleagues in news, our out network at the time did actually not have a single office operation or anything. And frankly, other folks had tried, but there was a lot of feedback in around the idea of, no, Asia's not ready. No, we can't do this. Like, no, we just don't do that here. And it really took myself as an expat, and another colleague who was Australian living in Japan, and a German living in Hong Kong, to really like kind of stand up to our leadership and say, we're not going to accept that this can't be done in APAC. And by the way, like Goldman Sachs, JP Morgan, like let me give you the list of other companies who are also here, and they have thriving, flourishing networks. So we really like set about the business. So I don't know if it was like waving the flag. I think it was more of, this is who we are as a firm, and this is part of what we've always said, and this needs to be global for every office. I think the thing we're all really proud about is really two things. One, as we looked at the entirety of our Asia Pacific operations, like there were very clearly the places like Japan where like it was, it was okay and clearly supported, especially having the head of human resources be openly gay. But it was more of really looking at the countries where like it was just downright illegal and or dangerous for our community. And that was actually probably the thing that felt most important to us, was that when we launched this, we needed, like there was a real debate of like, do we only do it in places that are more, I can't say Western because we were in Asia, but like a little bit more cosmopolitan or less like, like less backward. And I'm going to go that's probably the wrong word, but like just, not as progressive as we would want and hope the world to be. And we took this stance of, we couldn't control everywhere we operated or everywhere clients operated, but what we could control was the experience of our employees while they were within our walls. And we could, if it was just I can't say it, the 12 hours a day that they're at the office, could we create that safe space for them? And they don't even need to come out. Like, could they just know that that was a place where they could feel safe? And then I think, and so we did launch, and we're able to convince leadership that that was the right thing to do. And then, like, frankly, with Mark and Matt and a bunch of other folks, as they were all involved in the global teams at the time, this is all of our ERG networks at BlackRock now pretty much have a and allies kind of part of the naming culture. But one of the things I think we're really proud about is we knew that in APAC we could not be successful or would not be successful in not only establishing the network, but really sustaining it without ally support. And I'll go back to Japan. Okay, so you have 2 out expats, but there were no Japanese people who were out. And so our network, even at launch, was everybody was an ally. Now, truth be told, we knew who the folks were who were not out yet, and that's fine, and we respected that, but that's not how it was. And I think, those were 2 really important things to really, so I guess if we call that waving the flag, it's waving the flag, it's fine. But it was just really persevering, really engaging with allies, and really making sure we had that support, because we knew it was going to be critical to sustain. And the thing that made me the most proud is when I moved from Japan to Hong Kong, one of the things that happened is we had our first local Asian citizens in offices in India, in offices in Japan, in Singapore, and in Hong Kong. Folks who were Asian come out publicly, like they finally felt safe enough to do that. They weren't necessarily doing it at home in their kind of broader familial lives, but they were doing it at work. And we knew that like it was just the start, but that was something that we were helping change the experience of our fellow colleagues.
Thank you. And before I get over to Matt really fast, Mark, I think you may have some interesting thoughts on allies. Want to share with us that?
Yeah, so that's something that really resonates with me, because when Joe and Robert and others were launching the network in APAC, I was in the process of transitioning from more of a US based role to a global role within the network. And it was probably an oversight on my part at first, but I realized how important the concept of allies was. When this was happening, our networks did not have the word allies in the name. And this had been proposed before, and there were views given by people that were quite senior and were senior sponsors that, will that dilute the network for LGBTQ people? It's the out network. However, that was a very US centric view of things, because at a company like ours, it's so big in the United States. So I remember as I was transitioning into the global role, I was working with Joe, Robert, and others in APAC, and I went to an EMEA offsite, and I got off the red eye. I sat down in I think it was afternoon tea somewhere in West London, and they said, please, can you add allies to the name? And I said, well, I mean, I can call the graphics department and get it added. I mean, this isn't really that difficult, but explain to me why it's so important. And I'll tell you why it's important. It's the same comment that I made about smaller offices earlier, where you can't really start a network in an office of 25 people where there's one LGBT person, because that's not a network. And then there's places like Dubai and Riyadh where we have offices, and you don't have, like, being LGBT is somewhat challenging compared to others. So adding allies to the name ended up being the easiest and most impactful decision that we made as a network. A lot of the stuff that we've worked on in the past took months and months of work, but what this did is that it really took on a new life around the firm. The women's initiative ended up adding it to their name. All of our other networks have it now. And I think the other thing that went hand in hand with that is our EMEA team, as we were leading up to the 10-year anniversary and really embracing the idea of allies, especially internationally, is they created these pamphlets that were about 4 pages long, and they were printed on thick paper and put near the printers and in the kitchens. And they basically were how to be an LGBT ally at BlackRock. And they were so impactful because there were a lot of people, especially in these international offices, that wanted to engage. They may have had a child, a cousin, somebody else that identified as LGBTQ, but they didn't know how to engage because they were afraid to use the wrong word and potentially offend somebody or make a mistake. And I think the single best part, if I were to give a takeaway on how they pushed this initiative out to the rest of the firm, was that at the top of the page of definitions, they said terminology can be tricky and everyone makes mistakes. Allies too often shy away from LGBTQ people because they're afraid. We all deal with acronyms and professional jargon on a day-to-day basis. So here's what transgender means. Here is what gender identity means. Here is what sexual orientation means. So I guess the point is, where we really succeeded as a network and took it to the next leg of growth was when we embraced the idea of allies, and it was so critical for our success in Europe and Asia.
Nice. I think that resonates hopefully in a lot of different ways when we think about using or leveraging the ally opportunity or the groups to really kind of do some education and awareness, right? There's a lot of I don't know what to do or how to say or how to go about it, and they can learn those things through the ally networks that take place too. So definitely well said, Mark. Matt, you want to add anything to that? Any additional thoughts?
Yeah, I mean, to give a bit of perspective about what I've learned about Latin America, when I came down to Mexico, I kind of figured the same type of conversations that we're having in New York, we'd be having in Mexico City. But really, down here, the common cause that a lot of businesses are getting behind, that you're hearing a lot about on the news, is around equality for women and combating machismo and violence against women. So like those are the hot topics right now. In Mexico City, you don't see that everyone changes their Twitter handles or Instagram cover photos to a rainbow during Pride. It's really not as plugged in of a conversation. So when I got down to Mexico, there, out of our 300 plus person office, there was one other person who, identified as LGBTQ there. I was like, oh, great, I have a friend. But as I spent more time there, I realized there were quite a few queer people in the office, but the general sense was, I don't need to come out at work. What's the point? I'm going to separate my personal life from work. It's not going to help me, and it could, it could be uncomfortable. So I learned there was a bit of a hesitancy from people who were from Mexico to come out to their Mexican peers. versus some of the expats who were able to come out in the office. But slowly we started integrating some, Pride events and some Spanish speaking LGBTQ events, which I think that was a big breakthrough moment for us, because when you hear it coming from New York and it's all in English is one thing, but when it's coming from Mexico, from Mexican person, your native language, that's when the gears really start to turn. So after those conversations, as the, queer ambassador for Mexico, started having those DMs slide in saying, hey, actually, my brother's gay, and I've been trying to get involved. I didn't know how, or my best friend just came out. What do you think I should do? So there are those stories, and there all are those queer connections and relationships that people have, but it wasn't being discussed. So as you asked Michelle, like, do you feel responsible to really put yourself out there as an ambassador for the LGBTQ community? I do feel a little bit like that, because it seems like there was some sort of need for people to share and get that off their chest and find that common bond. So definitely find that there's opportunity here. But it was interesting, like, oh, we're dealing with problems that the US was dealing with 15 years ago. Okay.
Yeah. And you kind of hit on another thought that I was having. So, in the States, most of us are kind of used to hearing a lot of support for the LGBTQ community, right? For mostly our US based organizations, right? And I think you talked a little bit about, your Twitter handle or your Facebook page kind of changing to the rainbow logo, and just kind of seeing a potential difference outside abroad. And I can share with you uniquely, I remember when I came into BlackRock, funny enough, I remember I came in probably at the height of Pride, and I saw like little Pride gear everywhere. And I was like, I'm home. But a lot of my team members were all sporting the gear, and I really loved it. But when you think about the differences and what you saw in the LGBTQ presence while you're in offices abroad, share with us a little bit more about what that looks like. Maybe Joe, Mark, you guys want to tackle that?
Yeah, I mean, what's really interesting, it was like listening to you, Michelle, and thinking about it. Funny enough, I think we got a really good discount on rainbow flags from China. And then I think the truth is, when we were like, Mark is laughing, we had them made in China. We got them super low cost. And then, as this is back in the world, remember when everyone used to travel? We basically like filled people's carry-ons with like inexpensive rainbow flags, and we schlepped those around the world. And that's probably why they're everywhere in every BlackRock office, because we were just carrying them about. It was too funny. What's really, it was a real difference depending on what country in Asia Pac we were looking at, which probably comes as no surprise. I think Australia is famous on its own, and I don't need to go into that for its celebration and Mardi Gras, etc. Interestingly enough, even though Japan is a very like formal hierarchical kind of society and has a lot of kind of like formality and ways that it wants to do things, and it was like incredible gay pride, and I think it was just like it was just a really, really interesting experience and a really fun experience. It felt quasi-American in the celebration of gay pride, and like kind of the recognition and like frankly the support of folks there. What was really a juxtaposition was when you looked at countries like Singapore and Hong Kong. They're obviously like highly densified places, obviously bit large LGBTQ communities. And the in the office support was heavily strong. And frankly, I think probably because of just the pure expat populations. So I think like our colleagues who were locals felt very safe and supported, and like in the office was very strong. But if you looked at things like Pink Dot and kind of like the Singaporean crackdown on like the global organizations of support, things like that, like it's still really like I think a point of struggle. And so it really just depended on each locations. And I think to Matt's point earlier, what I found really interesting in being all these different places of the world is everyone's kind of somewhere on the continuum, right? So it's really like understanding like, where are we? Like, we may not be where we are in one place. I think there's certain countries in EMEA that are definitely far more progressive. The US is in a certain place. and then other countries around the world are kind of somewhere along that, and really understanding where that was and recognizing where, so that you know the starting point you're at in order to kind of do some of the work that you probably feel passionate about doing.
Nice. Thanks, Joe. And I will just say, I'm taking a look at some of the chat messages coming through, and I think you gave a lot of chuckles on the discount on the rainbow flags.
Yeah, I mean,
yes, I can say though that I was happy to see them. Mark, you want to add anything to that?
Honestly, no, because I'm busy answering a question on the chat.
That's okay. Matt, is there anything else you'd like to add to that?
I would say is I haven't really gotten to spend any time in the physical office since I started the role. So I'm very excited to start slowly like adding more rainbow paraphernalia around my desk and make sure we have like a banging pride event next June. I think that's going to be like that kind of watershed moment where we really start getting people involved in the community aspect of it versus just an inclusion diversity, we should be good people, but more so like let's have some fun with this. So I'm excited to push the gay agenda in Mexico a little further.
Awesome. All right, so unless Mark, you'd like to chime in a little bit more, I'm going to switch gears a little bit. Perfect. All right, so I'm gonna really switch gears, right? Because I want to get to the goods. I want to get to the fun stuff, because while we're working abroad, we're also having fun abroad, right? We're working hard and we're playing hard. So if we're gonna really inspire everyone that's listening to consider an international assignment, let's talk about what life outside of work looks like. So what's it like mingling outside of the US?
Well, look,
I'm just
I
gonna
mean,
let you guys choose who wants to go take that one.
I was like, I've been married for 17 years. That's for those two guys.
yeah, I mean, look, the first year was a bit of a like roller coaster where you move, you try to establish a good first impression, and like I mentioned earlier, the only people that you really know are people that you've been connected with before. And the nice thing with being abroad in most places, maybe APAC's not the same thing since it's like a 9-hour flight from Hong Kong to Sydney, but within EMEA, going from London to Paris or from like Madrid to Milan is like going from Boston to Philadelphia. So you get to go see a lot of places. And I feel like the first year was all about experiencing each culture, tacking on, what do they call it? Leisure, like business plus leisure together, where you have a work event Monday, Tuesday, but you go a little bit early. I know Kathy's on, please don't tell on me. But anyway, so the first year was a lot of fun, seeing the world and experiencing new things for the first time, and definitely doing my fair share of enjoying myself during non-work hours. But then the second year, I felt like I really wanted to, there was the chance I would live there for a lot longer than I ultimately did. Personal and professional things ended up dictating otherwise. COVID also had an impact on that, but really building an identity of mingling with people and understanding their culture and the types of things that they like to do. So the thing that I would say to everyone is that I wouldn't be the person and professional that I am today if I hadn't gone abroad. Being a global citizen is incredibly important because now when I work or manage or hire people from other places, I have a bit of a better understanding of what the workplaces are like there, what their prior company would have been like, but also where they are on their LGBT journey. And like I said, without getting into the gory detail, and I guess we want the goods. I can't give too many goods, but it was an awesome time. And those people, because of the time of my move back to the United States and Zoom became popular, which we're all doing right now. I think I had done 2 FaceTimes in my entire life before March 1st, 2020, but I hadn't even reconnected with my New York friends yet. And it was my London friends who got me through the first couple months of COVID because they were still my friends at the time, and I was at home alone with a 12-week-old puppy.
Oh, nice.
Yeah.
I think I'm hearing a little bit of what happens abroad stays abroad, though, Mark. Just saying.
No, that's just Ibiza.
All right. Matt, how about you? What was it like mingling? What is it like mingling? I know
I've
you're
got
abroad
plenty of
now.
tea to spill. Like I don't.
Go for it.
I'm an open book. Well, I had thought, because I'd been single in New York for 3 years before moving, I was like, I've got my battle scars, like I've got the thick skin, Mexico City, no problem. My Spanish is great. But then when I got down here, I realized like the dating dynamics, like there's a whole new book that was written down here about like the do's and don'ts of dating and like the push and pull of dating. Cause like in New York, it's kind of like whoever cares the least wins, right? So kind of slowly build, intimacy. Whereas in Mexico, they've been coming at me, really intense, and I feel really overwhelmed. And then the moment I start to catch a little bit of feelings, they ghost me. So it's like, damn, this keeps happening. So it's just a different dynamic of dating. I try not to take it too seriously, but it's been fun. There's definitely I didn't know this before moving down here, but a lot of people live at home until basically like they get married. So a lot of these people that I've met still live at home with their parents, and they're, 27, 28 years old. So that also creates a dynamic because you have some mama's boys over here that, haven't had to wash their own laundry ever. So, it's, all the time in New York plus packing up and moving to Mexico, a bit different life experience versus the people who, who get breakfast in bed still from their parents. So, it's been interesting.
Nice. I can tell you, I was abroad in China while I was mingling, while I was single. And I remember quite a bit, everybody was going home to mom, and I wasn't quite sure why, right? I was like, but that's just part of the culture. All the family sticks together. And I'm like, but you're 28 and you're working in this world. I don't understand why you're still under your parents' roof. But cultural nuances nonetheless.
Exactly.
So I know we're nearing the end. Go ahead, Joe.
I was going to offer, just in case anybody else on here is a parent or has like children, there is one real advantage. At least in the Americas, often like private schools are super competitive and all of that. But when you go abroad and you're like the only LGBT family and you have a child, like getting into exclusive schools is sometimes like you are really like a diamond. And so, if that's something that you're thinking about, like I was saying, like there's some real advantages. And then I think there's the corollary advantage, like our daughter remembers living in Tokyo, remembers living in Hong Kong, like having, like those have been meaningful, like developmental experiences for her that she's going to be able to take for her whole life. So like, it's one of those things like, yeah, there are challenges, but there's also some like advantages. You really do get to like being somewhat unique in a different culture, like can have its real advantages. And I think it's just like an amazing experience. So
awesome. Anything else anyone wants to add on that topic of mingling abroad? All right. Before we end, I do see a question in our chat that we have not touched on just yet. And this one is from Alexandra Sims. And it is, what would you suggest for organizations who are still working from home and getting new employees who may identify as part of the LGBTQ community? Mark, can we start with you?
I saw that question and I paused because it is very difficult. It's unprecedented territory for all of us. I think being together in person and getting to know people and having authentic, organic conversations, whether it be in the pantry or at a networking event, makes a lot of the things that we're talking about easier. And I think it's incumbent upon the LGBT networks at our firm to do what they can to create both virtual and in-person environments, given the restrictions wherever they may live, to bring new people into the firm. because look, if we were having this conversation on October 6, 2020, so 12 months ago, I think I would have a different answer because we were going into a very difficult winter, at least in the Northern Hemisphere, in terms of caseloads and return to offices being postponed 12 to 18 months. Like right now, the industry trend is that return to office is being pushed back a month at a time, but we're going ahead full speed with our future of work pilot on November 1st. So, and also we didn't have vaccines 12 months ago. And I do think there are things that companies can do to welcome people, even if it's not in the office, but there's nothing preventing people from having an information session or even, a happy hour with mocktails or cocktails or whatever to get people together. The thing that probably pains me the most as somebody who started my career at BlackRock and in the out network as a recruiter is that we built the foundation of our network as it stands today. And this is, again, apologies, US-centric comment, the foundation of our New York network and our current leaders through recruiting, things such as the Out for Undergraduate Business Conference and in Europe, the Year Out conference. And there are 2 analyst class, probably 350 people to 400 people each. I may be wrong on that number, but I think I'm in the ballpark, that have not been to an out network event. So that's like 800 people total. And they've also have not been into the office or met their colleagues. So they don't know that it's an inclusive environment. And so I think as we embark on our return to office plans, or for some companies, or even certain offices of ours, move to a more hybrid or permanent remote model, depending on the local regulations and the situation with the virus, that we do create these environments because we risk losing top LGBTQ talent if we don't engage with them. That's a lot of people, right? Like 800, 900 people haven't met anyone from our network.
Yeah, nice. Thank you, Mark. And so I'm actually going to open the floor to a special guest you guys have not heard from. It's Kathy Clemens from BlackRock. She is our global co-chair of our network, who may have some interesting thoughts on how we can engage in the virtual world. Kathy.
Hi, thanks, Michelle. I offered to jump in on this because we've been having a lot of these conversations about how we bring the network together when everybody's got Zoom fatigue, we're really busy, we're stressed out. We've, a year and a half into a global pandemic, and I think a few things have worked really well. So actually, Matt Chukatovich last year led a committee for the Americas where he basically had like Ask Me Anythings with leaders in the network. And, once a month there was a director or a managing director. Those are the more senior leader roles on our in our firm. Who basically, he was like, this is like a group coffee. So instead of like a one-on-one coffee, this is like a 1 on 30 or 40 person coffee. And he did a great job facilitating it and moderating it. And it was really fun to get to know people. And you would have I had people who like reached out to me and were like, hi, can I get time with you? I want to ask you about this thing. And BlackRock's the kind of place where people say yes to those requests. So that helped. And then we have some of our, Mark talked about our analyst class, and we have some of our 2020 analysts who are actually doing outreach to the 2021 analysts and trying to make that like really close connection. So it's not like these senior leaders who are like in our 40s and more trying to like, connect with the youngins, but it's actually like a little bit more of a peer-to-peer, like we're a step ahead of you, here's how we can get involved. And so we've actually been able to get a little bit of a double whammy of like getting that 2020 class engaged and then getting the 2021 engaged. And frankly, things like Out and Equal really help us do some of that too, because it's like we're doing this summit. Who's going to be the social coordinator for the summit? Who's going to be the person that like really drives the communications about it? And so it actually gives people professional development opportunities, gives them connectivity opportunities, and gives us a thing to come together around.
Thanks, Kathy. I was just about to speak on mute and I caught myself, but thanks so much for chiming in. I really appreciate it. So guys, we've got 5 minutes left, and I want to give Joe, Mark, and Matt one more opportunity to share any last minute, any thoughts or tips or advice you'd like to share with this group as they consider an international opportunity working abroad.
I think I may have already said it. Look at this is something that from a personal aspect, I always wanted to live and work in a culture that wasn't my own. And so that was just something that was like a lifelong priority for me. I'll leave with you guys with one last joke. I always thought, frankly, I was going to marry a guy with an accent. Turns out it's from New Jersey, but and so that's a good thing. But like, I think it's like, if you join this call because you're like, hey, I might really want to do this and I'm really thinking about it, like, do it. Like, I don't think you'll ever regret that experience. And what I hope we've shared is, yeah, like some of it's hard and some of it requires perseverance, but geez, like, look what we've done in the world. Like, you can do it. And then I think if you want advice and counsel, there's lots of there's my colleagues and friends here on the phone or Zoom. They're happy to we're all here to help. If you guys want to chat, like, we can do that too. But I would say, like, don't let complexity like keep you from your dream, if that's what it is.
Perfect. Thanks, Joe. We have 3 minutes. Mark, Matt, any last minute advice?
Yeah, I would agree, with Joe. You can always go home, right? My thought was, listen, I can go to Mexico if I don't like it. I've got that US passport, I can schlep my way back to the US if I have to. So I would definitely consider it. And I would say this is probably the most personal growth I've had, in just a short amount of time, which I've learned a lot about being alone and building new relationships and just cultural differences on a much more subtle, day-to-day level, which is, been an interesting journey. I would also make a plug, I'm working on building our LGBTQ network out here in Mexico City. So if we have anybody in Mexico City, please find me on this, the platform or on LinkedIn. Would love to connect.
I definitely saw someone say hello from Mexico City early on. So you are not alone, Matt. Mark, anything from you?
I would say do it, because I definitely did my fair share of complaining about the taxes, the paperwork, the bank, like everything. But what I tell people is it's going to be a pain for about 6 weeks, but after multiple years, your heart will be so full when you come back, or you will do what I failed to do, which is marry a British person.
Well, there's still time, Mark.
That's actually true. I'm going tomorrow.
All right. Well, thank you guys so much for joining us in our table talk as we discuss what is it like kind of navigating our cultural and professional challenges that may come with being abroad and being a part of the LGBTQ community. Again, thank you, Joe, Matt, and Mark for being here. And I hope that you guys all reach out in case you have additional questions. Thanks. Have a great evening.
Thank you.